Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for The Leftovers Season 1. This video is where I give an in-depth review of Season 1 of The Leftovers. This video is being made in preparation of Season 2, which begins in just a couple days. In fact, there's a big chance that it's already begun for many of you watching this video. But as I'm making it now, it starts in a couple of days, so to prepare for that, I'd like to take a detailed look at Season 1. This video does contain spoilers though, so if you haven't seen all of Season 1, you do not want to watch this video because things will be spoiled for you. Instead, you should check out my quick review of The Leftovers Season 1, which is completely spoiler free. I'll put a link to that video in the description below. But if you have seen Season 1, then please continue. So I'm going to give my first impressions and feelings of watching The Leftovers, and I had binge watched the entire first season over a couple of days, months after it had aired, and so I waited until I finished the whole thing to see what critics and audiences were saying about it, and in a lot of places I noticed my opinions went against the grain, so to speak, and in a lot of places differed wildly from popular opinion. However, like always, I don't let popular opinion dictate my own, so you'll get my unspoiled pure reactions to the show that you may disagree with wildly at times. However, the opinions I do agree with is that the show is really bleak. In fact, many point to that as a really negative thing, but I think bleak can work if it's pulled off well, and I think it's pulled off amazingly well here. I think you do get some glimmers of hopes and moments where people can feel great in amongst all the sorrow, and I feel that's where the show excels. The show is basically about a world immersed in loss, where everyone, regardless of whether or not they knew someone personally who had departed, was affected by the departure, and there was this subtle undertone everywhere you went that had affected all facets of society, and it was such a subtle thing that I felt it was pulled off really well, and the show does a masterful job of making you feel this undercurrent as well. As I mentioned in my quick review, I wasn't a huge fan of how the show was so hyper-focused on cults, as it seemed the effect of the departure was to empower and create a bunch of cults. Because it wasn't just the Guilty Remnant and Wayne's cult, it was heavily implied that there were all sorts of cults all over the place, and we did see that one group that drew like bullets on their heads. And this is one of those cases where I'm going to depart from popular opinion, but I was actually more interested in Wayne's cult than the Guilty Remnant, which may seem like a controversial statement since the Guilty Remnant were definitely the bigger focus of the show. I ultimately didn't find their sense of wanting to disappear and erase all sense of self in order to hyper-focus on the departure as interesting as someone who could give you magic hugs, who could take away your pain. You know who he reminded me of? He reminded me of Cybok from Star Trek V, who could magically take people's pain away. It's probably because I'm more attracted to fantasy that I prefer that. But don't get me wrong, I still love the Guilty Remnant storyline. I was just more interested in Wayne's. Which is also a controversial statement because I know many people didn't like that whole storyline with Tom and him taking care of Wayne's baby mama, but I disagree. I actually quite like that storyline and would say it is among my favorites. I know it was the most jarring storyline, and it was the only one that was completely separate from everything else happening. However, to me that just made it much cooler when it intersected the main storyline. If there's any one storyline that I didn't really care for, it's Meg's storyline, played by Liv Tyler. I found her character to be one of the least interesting. In the first few episodes that explored her joining the GR, I wasn't really interested in that at all. And of course, I do have to talk about the mysteries raised and all the weird shit that happened, because I was amazed at how many viewers were demanding answers, and I didn't really get that because I didn't see that as the point of the show. Many, for example, wanted the departure to be explained one day, but anyone involved with the show specifically said this will never be explained, and I personally never expected it to. Although I totally don't need answers, I think it would be a bit nice if they followed up on more of certain storylines. Like, I don't need to know exactly what the deal with the National Geographic magazine is, but it would be nice if we got a bit more follow-up on that. And there are a few other mysteries as well I would like to see explored more. And it's like what I said in my Lost reviews, that it's not about getting answers. I just think there's some great storytelling to be told exploring some of these mysteries, and if they don't, well, I just see it as a missed opportunity, that's all. So now let me delve into Season 1 by exploring each episode of the season, starting with Episode 1, The Pilot. I felt this was a great opener for the show and did an amazing job of setting the tone and introducing the characters. I liked the choice they made to not start off with the main characters in the departure, and instead showed the departure through one scene with a character who would not even be involved with the show, and then instantly jumping 3 years in the future, and then introducing the main cast of characters. I think that was really important, as the focus of the show isn't the departure itself, but how the departure has affected the lives of those who remain, and so it was great that they didn't focus too much on that. Later in the season, we would see what happened to the main cast of characters and what they were up to during the departure, but after we had already got a chance to know them really well, and I think that was a really smart decision. This episode did a very good job of introducing the Garveys and the Guilty Remnant and setting the stage for how bleak their lives have become. I particularly enjoyed the party scene, which I thought did a great job of showcasing how empty Jill's life had become. They tried to play a little trick on you in this episode to make you think Kevin's wife and Jill's mother had departed, but in fact it was the woman we had already met in the Guilty Remnant. So in fact, the main family the show focuses on didn't actually experience a departure in the family. Well, Lori did, but no one else in the family is aware of it, so that doesn't count. And yet, their family was still destroyed by the departure, as Kevin's father went insane, Lori joined the Guilty Remnant, Tom ran off to become one of Wayne's minions, and Jill became empty and estranged from her father. And of course, this all wasn't made entirely clear in this episode, but it set the stage for it, which would be explored in greater detail later in the season. I think they did a really good job at it. So my rating for the pilot out of 10 is an 8, extremely good. Next is Penguin 1 0, which was a decent follow-up to the pilot. We explore more about how troubled Kevin is and how he spends most of this episode looking for a bagel, and people don't believe that the guy who shoots the dog exists and think that Kevin's the one shooting dogs. And we meet Kevin's insane dad, which was all well and good. We also explore more about Jill and her friendship to Amy. Now, as I said in my quick review, I was completely struck with how similar Jill and Amy were to the teenage girls Jane and Angela in the film American Beauty. Because like Jane, Jill was, a depressed, socially awkward teen with a strained relationship with her father, and her best friend, Amy, was like Jane's best friend, Angela, insofar as she was the more socially attractive and outgoing one with a quirky sense of humor and was overall more upbeat. So the rest of the series, I would always refer to these two girls as the American Beauty girls. However, if I'm going to be completely honest, I actually felt these characters were more believable than the ones in American Beauty, as I really bought their friendship and they felt more fleshed out. Jill seemed more of a realistic portrayal of someone who felt empty inside rather than an adult's interpretation of what a typical rebellious teen would be like, which is what so many other shows and films do, so I appreciated that this show was more real with it. However, in this episode, it just seemed like Amy was just all of a sudden living with the Garveys, and this was never really explained how or why this happens. Correct me if I missed something, but I was particularly, looking out for this the second time I watched the show, and I still didn't catch any reference as to, why she was living with them. But so if you know, just leave it in the comments. This was also the episode in which Wayne's ranch was raided by the ATF, and Tom would be sent off on the mission to protect Christine, and told her, and they told her that their baby is of great importance, which I thought was really interesting as well. So my rating for Penguin 1 Us 0 is a 7, very good. Next is Two Boats in a Helicopter, the episode where we meet and follow Reverend Matt Jameson, and I'll be perfectly honest, I did not think as highly of this episode as many others seem to, as it seems to be regarded in very high esteem. Personally, I found this episode really boring for the first half, as I really wasn't that interested in this Reverend fellow, and mostly found him annoying. However, I will say the episode got much better towards the end and started to draw me in, with his struggle to get the money in time to keep his church. And it was interesting that the guilty remnant were the ones that took his church, meaning they weren't, scoping him out the whole time. They were actually scoping out the church. But the casino scene where he won all that money through gambling reminded me a lot of the scene in Run Lola Run, where she wins all this money, through gambling. And in both cases, I find it really unbelievable and seemingly a storyline that just appears out of nowhere. And when that one guy attacked him in the parking lot and tried to take his money, I found that really cliched and unnecessary. But I did appreciate the reveal of the Reverend Jameson's backstory of how his wife was paralyzed in an accident that happened during the departure. That was actually related to the opening scene we got. And I did find Matt to be a well-rounded character altogether. So my rating for Two Boats in a Helicopter is a 7, very good. So next is BJ and the AC, which mostly revolved around a plot about Jill stealing the baby Jesus from a nativity display, and Kevin at first acting like he didn't give a shit, and then was going out looking for it. I found the plot line to be pretty dumb, to be honest. However, as always, this episode contained a lot of great character moments. In particular was the scene in which Lori asked for a divorce by getting Meg to read a letter she wrote to Kevin, which I thought was a pretty effective scene. But all in all, this episode was nothing special, so my rating for BJ and the AC is a 6, good. After that, we got Gladys, which starts with a very powerful scene of one of the guilty remnant, Gladys, being stoned to death. We would later learn that it was the GR themselves that killed her, and she consented to it. The setup for this is there in this opening scene of the episode, as Gladys nods to Patty, sort of giving her consent to be killed. However, that stoning was totally brutal, and she yelled at them to stop, so obviously she had wavered at some point. However, this episode would go on to be nothing much special, as it involved a story about Patty taking Lori on a little trip and giving her a day off, which I found mostly kind of boring. What I found more interesting was Kevin's efforts to investigate this murder and how no one seemed to care, and him butting heads with an ATF agent who took Gladys's body and wouldn't return his calls. The time he finally did call him back was kind of creepy, as he was just being all normal, nonchalant, but then when he asked Kevin if he wanted them to take care of the problem for him, he was all of a sudden got really creepy and serious. It was a really chilling scene. However, I don't really buy this portrayal of the ATF as a band of cold killers that just go around killing everyone involved with the cult. This was also portrayed this way when they raided Wayne's ranch. I see that in a lot of movies, and I think it's a bit stereotypical, but whatever. Still a good episode though, so my rating for Gladys is a 7, very good. So then we get Guest, the episode in which we follow Nora Durst and how empty she has become. And I have to say right off the bat, I absolutely love this episode. I thought it was an amazing, well-rounded character story. I always felt there was something a little interesting about her and how she kept, guns. But this episode made me fully invested in her character. It was great how they started it off by having her hire a prostitute to shoot her while she wore a bulletproof vest. That was great in showing how messed up she'd become. And the conversation she had with Kevin at the courthouse when she randomly asked him to go away with her to Florida, it showed her new state of, not the stereotypical depression, but something more awkward and unique, showing a certain level of empathy. And of course, the conference was great as well, as Nora had to deal with someone impersonating her and how paranoid that made her. It was interesting how she suspected that one woman of being the one who stole her badge, but it turned out to be a woman she had insulted the previous year. Kind of shows how volatile she could become. And it's interesting that she could see a noticeable difference in the way people treated her because she just had a badge that said guest as opposed to a badge that signified her as a legacy survivor, and the whole time she never actually pointed out that she had lost her whole family. Even when people talked about that one dude who wrote a book who lost 4 members of his family, she never stopped and said, hey, I lost my whole family. Or at that party when people were complaining about how entitled legacy survivors were, she never actually said anything. I personally don't think she entirely disagreed with them, but that was really interesting when the impersonator framed her for damaging hotel property, which led to her getting thrown out. She was determined and was on a mission to prove that there was a fraud impersonating her, and when she finally confronted her at the conference, the impersonator made some statement about, against the departure commission. She was no longer really angry because she realized she was just thinking it was all about her, but wasn't aware that there was something totally different involved. And the ending was absolutely amazing, how she met Wayne, and he could see right through her and read her instantly, and his magic hug seemed to work. First of all, I like how they brought Wayne's storyline back to the main fold, and secondly, it's unclear whether he really does have magical hugs, but it is clear there's something special about him, and he really does have a positive effect on people. So my rating for Guest is a 10, the best. So that's followed up by Solace for Tired Feet, which is a pretty interesting episode where Kevin's crazy father escapes the institution and starts wreaking havoc all around town. It does really make me think that he is actually hearing someone talking to him, and he isn't altogether insane, as Kevin seems to be going through something similar. I personally find it more interesting to think that there is meaning to what Kevin's father is saying, and he isn't just raving like a madman. Also, this is where Kevin and Nora's relationship starts to spark up, which was pretty interesting. Also, Tom's story becomes really exciting, as after making a delivery requested by Wayne, he discovers another guy protecting another Asian woman pregnant with another one of Wayne's children, which makes him completely question what he's doing and how much he believes in Wayne, as he's obviously a liar, and it makes it seem that Christine's baby isn't all that special after all. But it's interesting that he never tells Christine about it. I suppose seeing how the other woman reacted, he knew nothing good would come of it. It was kind of frustrating how he broke Wayne's phone and can no longer talk to him. I'd be really interested to hear what the conversation would have been like once he confronted Wayne about this. But overall, a really solid and interesting episode. So my rating for A Solace for Tired Feet is a 9, excellent. So then we get to Cairo, which was an absolutely amazing episode. Kevin wakes up and finds himself at a cabin with this mysterious dog shooting guy, and apparently they had beaten up Patty and dragged her to the cabin and had her tied up. This is when Kevin first becomes aware that he's losing his memories and apparently is acting like a different man in these missing time periods. They, of course, had been leading up to this and hinting at this for a while, with the dog that just came out of nowhere and his missing shirts, and Amy talking about this time period that he doesn't even remember. And these are all answered in this episode because he finds his missing shirts out by the cabin, and the dog apparently was the product of a bet he made with the dog shooter guy. It was really funny how the dog shooter guy was just like, oh, go take a nap because I want to deal with the other guy. And he was like, there's only fucking me. It makes it seem like there's a Fight Club type situation going on here where he's got another personality that takes control of him. And of course, Patty is just goading him into killing her the whole time. It's clear she wants to die. So eventually Kevin lets her go and says he'll admit what he's done and face the consequences, but she just kills herself anyway. I don't necessarily agree with what Matt would say later on, that she did it in order to get back at him, in order to implicate him, because after she's dead, he could easily just hide her body and pretend like nothing ever happened, which is in fact what he does. But if she did come back to town alive, then she'd be able to implicate him and he'd be in more trouble. So it was more about her beliefs which determined that it was time for her to die, and of course to send Kevin a message and to try to affect his life. But man, that conversation they had together in the cabin was so riveting. And even the side plot to this episode was amazing, as Jill was obsessed with Nora and didn't buy how she was okay all of a sudden. It's funny, this mirrored how Nora reacted to that author guy in New York, as she said there was no way he could be okay, but then she found out it was because of Wayne, and then herself became okay. So now it was Jill questioning her, but Jill ended up having a different epiphany when she discovered Nora still had a gun, thus proving she wasn't okay. It didn't have the effect that she had expected. She didn't feel triumphant, it just made her feel worse. And that was so powerful. Also, this episode in which Jill and Amy finally had their falling out, it's funny she accused her of sleeping with her dad, because I kept thinking of Jill and Amy as the American Beauty girls, and because in American Beauty the father ends up almost sleeping with the friend, and there's this attraction going on between the father and the friend. So I kept expecting something similar to happen here. They did kind of hint at something in past episodes, but it was much more subtle, and it's obvious nothing ever happened. So I found Amy's response classic, where she was just like, yeah, I fucked him, which is another way of saying, fuck you for even asking. That was such a riveting and powerful scene. So my rating for Cairo is a 10, the best. So next is the Gradys at their best, and this is where I get into a massive disagreement with the common consensus, because I was so riveted by Cairo, I couldn't wait to find out what happened in the next episode. So I was so pissed off when I found out the next episode would be entirely a flashback episode, and I have to wait until the next episode to see the conclusion I so desperately wanted to see. I was very tempted to just skip this episode and go back and watch it after I had watched the conclusion, but I managed to control myself and watch it. But the whole time I was watching it with a I'll just get on with it attitude. And other than that, I was surprised by the reaction most people had at this episode, as being completely blown away by it, because that wasn't my reaction at all. In fact, the way I reacted to it was this was nothing new. It is in fact something I've seen done several times before. The most noted example was in season 1 of Heroes, where they had an episode that took place 6 months ago, and all the characters were completely different because it was before all this shit went down. So I wasn't surprised at all to see Jill act like a quirky teeny bopper, or Patty as a broken down person seeing a psychologist, or Tom as a happy-go-lucky teen. I mean, don't get me wrong, I thought all this was interesting, but I just wasn't blown away by it like most people seem to be, because I saw, when I saw there was going to be a flashback, that's exactly what I expected them to do, because as I said, I've seen several shows do this before, so this felt like nothing new to me. That being said, I did still really like this episode. The beginning was really boring and I was losing patience with it, but it did get much better at the end. It was really interesting seeing Kevin and Lori's relationship fall apart, and of course the irony of Kevin wanting to leave his family before the departure, and then after the departure his family just falling apart, which would be explored more in the finale. That was really good. And of course, seeing where everyone was at the time of the departure, many of this having been hinted at before, was amazing to see. But ultimately, I feel very strongly about this. I would have liked this episode a lot more if it were episode 8, not episode 9. As I alluded to earlier, I totally agree with their decision to not show this at the beginning of the series and wait until we already knew all these characters a lot more. That made this episode so much more powerful. However, it should have been episode 8, not 9. The break between Solace for Tired Feet and Cairo just seemed like a much more appropriate place to go back and do a flashback, as there was a natural break in tone between those episodes, even though Solace was setting up for the big finale. Cairo, on the other hand, was just too riveting of an episode, and I feel is more connected to the Prodigal Son Returns as they make a natural two-parter, and it was a huge mistake to divide those two episodes, and it made me feel really impatient with this episode. I can only imagine how outraged I would have been had I been watching this show on a weekly basis. So my rating for the Garveys at their best is a 7, very good. If I'm just going off standalone, I'd give it like an 8, possibly a 9, but because I have to take into account that this was episode 9 when it should have been episode 8, makes me drop the rating to a 7. So finally we get to the Prodigal Son Returns, which was the amazing finale I was hoping for. It does really drive home what the Guilty Remnant are all about, as they feel the departure is the only thing that matters and people shouldn't just be moving on with their lives, which is why they chain smoke, because they no longer have regard for the health, and they don't talk and wear all white in order to minimize all sense of self. It turns out that guy Nora met at the conference that sold the replicas of people that had departed was just a setup for this, as the GR ordered replicas of all those that departed in Mapleton and placed them in everyone's homes, which of course created a massive black backlash to lead to members of the GR being hunted and beaten in the streets and their houses being burned. But ultimately they didn't care, because making people remember the departure is more important to them than their own lives. And also the whole storyline with Kevin was amazing, as he called on Matt to help him take care of the Patty situation. And the conversation they had at that diner was amazing. And then Kevin meets Wayne, who is dying as he had foreseen, and he grants Kevin one last wish before he dies. And there's no doubt in my mind that Kevin's wish was to have his family back, because he was just talking about how before the departure he just wanted them gone, and after he got his wish and his family fell apart. And an argument could be made that he got his wish, because by the end of the episode he saves Jill's life and they seem to reconnect. Tom returns to town, Lori begins to snap out of her daze, and Nora decides not to leave him when she's presented with a new child. Now, there's a lot of speculation on whether Wayne's powers were genuine. I think they are. I mean, an argument could be made in this episode that Nora snaps out of it and realizes she's not okay, so Wayne's magic hug seemed to fade. But ultimately, I think it's more than just a drug-like haze of being happy. It's real happiness, and real happiness isn't infallible and can be tested, like it was in this episode, as when the GR made Nora confront her past, it brought back all those emotions. However, when Nora saw the baby, she was reminded she could still have a future, and thus Wayne's magic hug ultimately wins out. And it's interesting how, he said he thought he was a fraud. I think that was more of him doubting his own abilities rather than confessing the truth, which is why he wanted to grant Kevin a wish, because he wanted to die believing his powers were real. It's also funny how Wayne and the Guilty Remnant are opposing forces, as the GR just want people to remember the departure and never move on, where Wayne is all about just getting people to forget their sorrows and move on with their lives. And it's interesting seeing that battle fought within Nora herself. By the way, that ending narration scene with Nora's letter was such an amazing scene. Lori also had a revelation as she seemed completely committed to the GR, but when faced with the death of her daughter, she realized past attachments still mattered to her. That way she broke her silence by screaming, "Joe!" at Kevin so Kevin could go save her was amazing. So my rating for The Prodigal Son Returns is a 10, the best. So if I were to rate the 10 episodes of Season 1 in order from my least favorite to my favorite, it would go 10 BJ in the AC, 9 Gladys, 8 Two Boats in a Helicopter, 7 Penguin 1, Us 0, 6 The Garveys at Their Best, 5 The Pilot, 4 Solace for Tired Feet, 3 Cairo, 2 The Prodigal Son Returns, and 1 Guest. As for my hopes for Season 2, I'm actually kind of glad Season 2 won't focus on the Guilty Remnant, as I think they played them out as much as they could. But I'm a bit skeptical about it being so drastically different and a lot of characters we got to know and love not being in the show anymore, as typically when a show changes so drastically like this, it doesn't really go down that well. Damon Lindelof compared it to Season 2 of The Wire, which was a massive change as it focused more on dock workers all of a sudden. Personally, I didn't mind that change in The Wire, but a lot of people didn't like that season, so we'll just have to see where they take The Leftovers. As long as they continue to tell amazing, riveting character stories, I'll be happy. Also, I'm happy they're keeping Nora Durst. I might have had to quit the show if they had gotten rid of her. So that's it for my full review of Season 1 of The Leftovers. As for Season 2, I decided rather than reviewing every episode after it comes out, I'll review it in batches. So after episode 4, I'll review the first 4 episodes in one video, and after episode 7, I'll do another video for episode 5, 6, and 7, and after episode 10, I'll do another video for episodes 8, 9, and 10. And then I'll do an overall Season 2 review as well. So make sure you subscribe so you can keep up with all that, and thanks a lot for watching.